pivot tables just as we did previously. We need to have the data in a data frame, which we already have as df renewable. Next, we introduce a new step because the time series column needs to be in a single column. Instead of having each series in separate columns, we should have them in a single column indicating the type of technology. And then in another column, the generation it has produced. Why? When creating the pivot table, we need to tell it that in the index, we want each of the technologies. And when using the pivot table function in the index parameter, we currently don't have a column to specify each of the technologies. So we go to the data frame and indicate the melt function. This means it will melt the columns to place them by rows. If we execute here, you see the change. We now see photovoltaic, solar and wind in the values of one column, instead of being in the header. The temporal information has been lost. If I want to recover it, there must be a parameter, in this case ignore index, which by default is true. I'm going to set it to false so it doesn't ignore it. We save the result in a new variable. Next, we're going to change the column names, so instead of saying variable and value, I want it to say technology and generation, which are more representative. And now we finally have that column that we can indicate to the pivot table in the index parameter, so that each row places each of the unique technologies. But for now, we're not going with the pivot table, because we have to create the columns with the temporal information from the index. Just as we did in the previous lesson, we use the data frame with the assign function, indicating I want the year, I also want the month, and so on. Execute. We overwrite again in the variable so that the changes are saved. And now we proceed to make the pivot table. Therefore, pivot table function. In each of the rows, I want the technologies. So in the index parameter, we're going to put the technology column. In the columns, as we did before, we're going to want the year and the month. Then the values that we want to aggregate will be the generation. And the aggregation function we're going to use will be the sum to see how much each of the technologies has generated each month. Execute. And here we see the result. Just as we did before, we're going to make the code more readable by adding a line break. Save again in the variable. And now we're going to style the data frame with colors. We use background gradient. However, here it doesn't make much sense because wind will always have a higher generation among all months except in summer. And the colors are light or dark because we only have two types of technology. To get an overall perspective of how all technologies behave over a year, in the next chapter, I'll explain how to perform that multivariate analysis and even a correlation map to see which types of technology behave similarly among themselves.